Okay, in this video, I just want to spend a little bit of time talking again about this idea of a universal file name structure. There was a pretty long discussion on Facebook recently among some vendors who were pretty dissatisfied with this idea. And I understand it, and I just wanted to address a couple of their thoughts and concerns because I think it's important. The first thing I just want to make really clear, one, everything that we're doing here in this UCS world is completely voluntary. Nobody's expected to adopt it if they don't think it's the right fit for them, for their libraries, for their customers. Then simply don't use it, of course. Two, the file name in particular is completely optional. When we talk in a little video we'll do in a minute about the vendor requirements, the file name is not part of the requirements for claiming that you're sort of UCS compliant. It never has been. We would encourage people to consider this, and I want to make the case for it one last time here in this video to discuss why we came up with a file name structure, what's the problem we think it addresses, and discuss a little bit about some of the criticisms about it, and that'll be it. And if it doesn't fit for certain vendors, then absolutely we understand that, and they shouldn't have to use it. I wanted to address a couple of the concerns that were raised. The first concern was simply that it's an ugly file name that is not very user-friendly and very readable. And I understand this concern, I really do. My argument would be that it's not readable because it's not familiar, first and foremost. So my argument would be that whatever the file name structure is, your mind will adapt to it and you will get used to it and it will become readable. To me, this file name structure is very readable because it's something I've been using on and off for 20 years, this sort of structure. My other argument would be that the uniformity of a file name system will actually make things more readable in the long run. Right now, with every vendor sort of choosing their own file name structure, and some of them are very, very different from each other, when you put a bunch of those files together, every one of them has its own logic to it, its own internal sort of structure, and your brain has to adapt constantly, moving from one to the other to another. At least with a uniform file name, your brain will adapt, will expect to see those pieces of information in that order that they are, and fairly quickly, I believe, that file name becomes actually just as readable as any other file name. So one of the arguments was our file name is purely meant to be machine readable. Well, it is meant to be machine readable to some degree. It's meant to be scriptable, and I'm going to show off a little bit, again, why we did it this way and the power that comes with that. So for sure, we meant the file name to convey a certain amount of information, independent of the program that's using it, that can be parsed out into metadata, reshaped. And so the file name is meant to contain a certain amount of information. I will say that if you really hate the file name, it's very easy to rebuild a new file name. The benefit of our system, the benefit of a structured file name is all of the pieces you'll want to rebuild the file name to your liking will be in the file name already. So vendor, library, category, subcategory, effects name, vendor category, potentially microphone. All of these pieces of information can be sent to the end user in the file name. And very quickly, and I'll show a little bit of an example of this, they could simply take the file name and just rebuild it to whatever they like in their file name. If they have a logic to their own file name, then very easily they can take this universal file name and just restructure it. What they can't do is if every vendor out there supplies their own logic and their own structure in the file name, is to very easily convert those to their own. Every single library and every single vendor would have to be dealt with sort of on their own. We'd have to sort out the logic of how their file name came to us and then figure out how to build a workflow or a scripting setup to basically change that. And I can tell you, as somebody who maintains a library for a facility, that becomes a real pain in the ass to sort of get very different file names from very different vendors constantly and have to go through one by one and to figure out how to reshape the file names. Because in our setup, we want a universal file name or a uniform file name at least for our facility. And so as a librarian, it becomes very challenging to sort of constantly take file names from various vendors and to reshape every one of them and have to sort of develop a new scheme every single time a new library comes in. That's one of the reasons that we developed this idea of a universal file name as a delivery mechanism. It doesn't mean that the end user is stuck with it. They're able to change it to their own permanent file name in their library very easily. So let's just switch over to SoundMiner a little bit and show a couple of examples of, again, my arguments for the file name, and then we'll kind of let it go. Again, just to say one last time, the idea of the file name structure is completely voluntary. So here I am in SoundMiner, and I'm going to call up a database that has all these free sounds that were handed out during the Game Developer Conference by Sonus, they compiled every year a pack of free sound effects from a wide variety of vendors, probably 1,000 different vendors or so, and they made them available over the various years. So this is actually, I think, a compilation of 2015 through 2018, maybe, and all of the files loaded into SoundMiner with the metadata and the file names exactly as they came to us. So if I just start scrolling down a little bit, I think you'll start to see that, some of these files have quite good metadata. Some of them have almost no metadata. If you concentrate on the file names here, you'll start to see there's just a wide discrepancy of file names, from something as simple as Dice9 to something that has the library listed first, then a category. Some are all in uppercase, some are all in lowercase. Some are coming in with lots of underscores. Some are going to come in with commas. Some are going to come in title cased, uppercase, lowercase. My argument would be that, well, any of these file names might have some internal logic. The fact that there's no standardization at all to these makes these quite unreadable to me as I'm working through my library. Every time I look at one of these, I have to sort of rediscover what's the logic of this file name, what pieces of information are where in it, things like that. Numbering scheme at the beginning, numbering scheme at the end. So my argument would be that a standardized file name, even if you think it's an ugly file name, would be a lot more useful in the long run than what we have right now, which is every vendor just picking some completely different scheme that they think works. And it might be that every one of these vendors thinks their file name is perfectly readable to them because it's what they're used to. It's what they've built their library around. But as an end user, my argument would be that file names like this aren't nearly as useful. They don't convey enough information in any kind of a logical order that we can actually easily script any of this information out. So if we look at some of these files that have, very little metadata, it would be pretty difficult and time consuming to go through one by one or group by group to try to figure out, okay, what piece out of this file name could I actually populate over here into subcategory or category or designer, library, things like that. For the ones that don't have categories, to try and go through and try to figure out what category they're in, you'd have to kind of read through the whole file name because it's not going to be clear at the beginning or just at the end or in a very specific place each time. It's going to be moving all around. Some of them may not have any information in the file name that will help you with the category. And of course, some of them do come with categories, but they're not uniform. You're going to have ambience, which is spelled wrong or spelled not in the English fashion that I would expect. You'll see some that'll say background, some that'll say ambience. You have things like abstract and game audio, sound effects. There's quite a few variants of this. SFX sound effects, which, they're all sound effects. I'm not sure I would call that a category. So to me, looking at this 3,500 sound effects, this is almost an insurmountable amount of work to try and actually make this usably uniform and consistent and workable to me. And because I'm working for facility and in my library I want it to be very organized, I simply would never take the time to try to organize these sound effects. And I wouldn't put them in my library as is. Now, maybe you're okay with that. You can simply drop all these in and just live with the fact that you're just kind of searching through all of these basically on just file names and the keyword. That's all you have on many of these. If all of these vendors had taken the time to use our file name structure, or even a consistent file name structure, let's say ours, then with one button press, we would be able to extract a lot of useful information out of that. And I just want to give you an example. I'm going to switch to another database here. I'm going to drop some files in here that are compliant with the UCS file name. Looking at these, there's a nice uniformity to them. I know that at the very beginning of all of these is the cat ID, which might seem unwieldy, it might seem not particularly readable, but I promise you over time you'll get very used to these things and you'll be able to see immediately what they are. Design ethereal, food, eat and drink, animal insect, ambient suburban, water steam. So this is just a problem of familiarity. It's going to be new to you for a while, but over time you know that the designer in the show or the designer in the library are going to appear at the end. So I see my initials and I know that these weren't just done for any particular show. These were just done as part of a Zoom meeting that I did on mastering. But what the real power of the file name comes in its ability to take the information back out. So this program like SoundMiner has a lookup table that has a list of initials that we can split out. We can basically find TN and fill in the designer as my name. So I'm going to switch to a slightly different view. Okay, so now that I have these loaded, I want to show you how to use the extraction workflow in SoundMiner to pull these file names out into the various metadata fields. So I'm going to open up the workflow window and I'm going to call up the UCS extract. And you can tell that the source is the file name. I could be using another field if this sort of was built and stored somewhere else, but it's the file name. I want to extract the user category and the vendor category if it finds them. So if it sees this dash here, it's going to basically fill it into user category. Here it's going to see that umbrella is marked as a optional vendor category. And there's more discussion on this in the previous video on actual how to use the file names and how to use these. But it does exist here, so this workflow is going to find it. The creator ID, which is this TN, I'm going to tell it to basically put into designer. And what it's going to do is it's going to look in its lookup table, which we talked about previously a little bit. It's going to find these initials and it's going to fill in my name. So instead of TN going into designer, it's going to put Tim Nielsen. The source ID, I'm going to have mapped to show. It's simply going to take the none and place none in show. I like to keep track of the fact that these weren't recorded for a particular movie or project, so I just put none. And we don't have any user data in these files. If you watched the previous video, you know that if there was another underscore at the end of this and any additional string of text, that's what we call in user data. That could be mapped to any other field. So for example, if somebody had delivered something with the microphone stored there, I could say, go ahead and take the user data and strip it out and put it in microphone. In this case, there isn't any information in that, so I'm going to just tell it to ignore it. But what you'll see is that with one button press, select all the files, the workflow is going to go through, match the category ID to the category table, pull in category, move this out of the way, category, subcategory, build a category full. And you'll see in the words category full, it actually keeps the user category there. So rain general exterior, rain general interior. It does fill in the user category. It found these optional vendor categories here. It put them into vendor category. It built an effects name. So it took this middle chunk of the file name and moved it over to here. And I could have, if I wanted to here, told it to uppercase that as well. So like in my case, I like the effects name to be uppercase, so I'll just run it again. And you'll see that it basically uppercased the effects name. So purely a choice. I prefer it that way, but a lot of people don't. So you could have it either way. Again, it took the TN here out of the file name and it matched it and filled in Tim Nielsen. And so because of this rigidity in the file name, we've basically been able to fill in all this information with literally one button press. There's no way to do that with something delivered like the GDC sounds. Every single one is different. You'd have to go through one by one, and it would take literally weeks, I think, to basically turn that into a uniform set of metadata if that was your goal, whereas the file names as delivered in the UCS one button press basically has filled in all of these useful information. Now, the one thing it doesn't fill in is the description. You could use the effects name if you wanted, or hopefully the vendors have embedded descriptions. Sometimes they do. That's a B-Wave field that can be embedded by almost any program. So, but everything else has pretty much been filled in. So let's say now that I have this information pulled out of the file name, or let's just say that this came in as metadata, and let's just say that I really, really hate this file name structure. Fair enough. Let's look at basically building a new file name using the same kind of workflow. So I'm going to switch to a different view that kind of builds from left to right. So now our file name is over here on the right. So let's say I want to reshape this. Let's say I just really detest this and I want to change it to a structure that I really like. Well, the fact that these are all uniform in their sort of layout with the same piece of information in each spot. And again, watch the previous video if you want to understand what this structure is using the underscores and whatnot, or go to the Google Drive homepage documentation. There's a PDF sort of document there. I think it's a Google Sheet now, actually, but that explains this sort of structure. But let's say you really didn't think this was readable and you wanted to change it. Well, one of the arguments is people don't like the cat ID at the beginning. So let's get rid of the cat ID. So I'm going to come back to workflows and I'm going to clear this. We have a workflow posted up on the Google Drive that basically is remove cat ID from the file name. And this is just using a regex term to basically look for all the text up to the first underscore. Well, we know because the file name is fairly rigid that anything before the first underscore is the cat ID. So simply by running that, basically the cat ID is now stripped out. So great, there you go. There's one part solution to it right there. Now, fairly easily, let's say, I'm going to just undo that because I want to show you how to build sort of a compound thing. But let's say in addition, this, I don't want the username and I don't care about the show in this file name. So I'm going to come here to find and replace in the file name, and I'm going to say find underscore tn underscore none, which we see that string there, and just leave this blank. And that's simply going to remove it. So now when I run this, you'll see it strips the cat ID and it strips the tn none. And now fairly quickly, I have, what some people would consider a better file name, certainly readable. Doesn't show you the category, anything like that. But another thing you could do fairly easily, I'm going to undo, just put it back the way it was, is to say, now that we have a category over here, right? We have a category that's available, just a nice clean wording of a category. So let's say I want to have the category at the beginning of the file name. Well, one easy way to do it is to use something called field build. And I'll pull this out and I'll say I want to build the field file name. And what you'll see are these little brackets, these arrows, and what these are the terms that are going to be put together. So I'm going to say build it out of the category, then put space, dash space, let's say. So this is the term in between. And then let's use the file name as it was. So now once we get this stripped out of it, we're going to be left with the file name. And now I want to prepend the category to the file name. And let's make sure that we leave it a long length so we don't truncate anything. And now when I run it, you'll see that basically I've made a new file name that has the category right at the beginning. And, to some people, this is actually a scheme that quite a few vendors are using. So if that was my goal, there you go. Now I have file names that are arguably more readable. They contain less information, but if I don't care about that information, then great. I've basically now, with one button press, done this. Now, imagine you just bought 20 different libraries from 20 different vendors. If they all came to you with this uniform file name structure, you'd simply be able to run this same workflow again exactly as it's written, and you can store this. You can say file save as. With one button press, you'd immediately be able to fill in all this information and shape the file name to exactly what you want. So I hope that gives you an idea of why we tried to sort of come up with this standardization for the file name. It really allows a lot of power when it comes to resculpting metadata and even rebuilding its own file name. And none of this is possible without the sort of rigidity of the file name structure that we've come up with, or at least a rigid file name structure. Right now, there's no such thing out there. Every vendor has their own. So every vendor you basically purchase from, you'd have to come in here. You could build a custom workflow to sort of figure out, okay, what is the Recordist using? What is SoundMorph using? What is Boom, Tonstrom? What are they using for their file name structure? And you could build a workflow for each vendor to sort of go through and change the file name to what you want or parse out certain pieces of information, etc. My final argument again would be that if they would all adopt our standard for delivering file names, you could very easily sculpt that file name to whatever you want. You could very easily pull out a lot of useful information, vendor, library, category, subcategory, effects name. All of these, even things like microphone or recorder or location, could be stored in the user data. And with one button press and one workflow, you could basically have a completely organized library. So let me just show you one last thing. So let's say you wanted to build UCS file names and supply them to your users. Well, you have two options. You could actually build the file name compliant. One thing that was discussed with some of the vendors who really didn't like the idea of supplying them that way would be to sort of build the file name in metadata and offer that to the user later. Well, I'll kind of show you that if the metadata is solid and the metadata includes all of the fields, that it's pretty easy for you to build these UCS file names if that's your interest. So I'm going to drop in a set of file names that we know have all of this structure correct, and I'm going to basically go ahead and come back here to extract these. And again, I'm going to use the designer and I'm going to use the show, and we'll leave the effects name as is. So well, actually, let's uppercase it. So again, I'm going to run this and we're going to pull out all this information. Well, now, so let's again say that I'm going to use this regex term and I'm going to strip the category ID out. And then I'm going to do a find and replace. And so let's say I'm going to come here to the file name and take this and strip it out, _tn_none. So I'm left with just this. Let's say that you want to build UCS file names. Let's say you're a vendor and you want to go ahead and do this. Now I have a much more elaborate tutorial going through many examples of this that I'm working on, but to give you a brief example, there is this build function. So because I extracted all of these UCS common sort of fields out of there, I can reverse this process. And now I can just build a new file name using all of these pieces. So if it finds the user category and the vendor category, go ahead and use them. Take the effects name as it is, which is all uppercased, or let's say I hate the uppercase and I want to title case it in the new file name. So I want to go back to capitalizing only the beginning of each word. And the creator, again, I'm going to use the designer field. And what you'll see is it's going to take my name and it's going to use that same lookup table and it's going to go, Tim Nielsen is supposed to be TN. So it's going to, in the file name, use TN rather than the full name Tim Nielsen, which is great. We're going to use an abbreviation to save some space. And the source ID is the show. It's going to use the word none. And there's no user data, so we'll ignore that. But if there was user data, I could pull it from any field. So let's say I had microphone and I really wanted to put that at the end of each file name. Some vendors do this, so it could say MKH8040 or Sennheiser 416 or something. I could append that. In this case, I don't have anything there, so there's no point in putting it. That field is blank. And then the destination is the file name. Well, now here, as a vendor, is where you have a choice. You can go ahead and build the actual new file name, and when I hit run, it will build an actual UCS-compliant file name based on all of this metadata over here. But I could also, if I didn't want to change my original file name, let's say I really wanted it delivered to the user as is because I think that's a better file name, well, what I could do is come down here and say, well, go ahead and build this and put it in somewhere else. Let's say we could put it in user comments, which is a field that's probably pretty unused for most Salmon users. So, and if nothing else, it's a great delivery field. They could then take it and copy user category to file name if they wanted to. So I could put it here into user comments, which would basically be a way of delivering a UCS file name without actually using the UCS file name. But in this case, let's just go back to the file name. And what I usually do is kind of pick one first and just run it as a test. And when I run it, you'll see that it basically went ahead and put doors wood, hallway thin, closet door shut, TN underscore. So it built a fully UCS compliant file name. So I'm going to undo that, I'm going to select all, I'm just going to hit run. And basically you'll see that it's going to go through and it's taking all of these various pieces and using this really amazing workflow, it's basically built the file name just that quickly, right? So, and to double check that it did, I can come in here and I can just remove all of this metadata, strip it all out. I have a little hotkey to do that in a script. And now basically I could come back here to the extract thing again and, verify that it pulled it all out correctly because I'm just going to go ahead and put all these things right back where they were. So go ahead and now extract it back out the other way. And you'll see that it went through and does exactly that. It found all the pieces in the file name, matched them up appropriately, and it filled it all back in. And that's really the power of this structured file name, is what it allows you to do in moving and manipulating metadata and fields and file names and all of these things. So thanks for watching. I think that's all I wanted to say about the file name structure, why we created it, why I think it's a very useful tool. It's not a great fit for everybody. I understand some people feel very strongly against using it. Again, I've made my argument, and I think that's probably the last we'll say about that. Just to recap, the file name is purely optional. The only part of the file name we sort of talked about as a vendor requirement, and we'll talk about that in the next video I'm going to post at the end of this playlist on vendor requirements, is the use of the cat ID at the beginning of the file name. And I think we just showed that a user could so easily strip that out. So if you kept your file name exactly as it was, assigned a category based on our system, and prepended the category ID underscore to the beginning of your file name, that's all you have to do to have your file name technically be compliant. If you want to use the UCS logo and put it on your artwork, that's all it would take. And any user could simply remove that. If they hated it as well, if you hate it and they hate it, they simply remove it. But the presence of it is still a powerful tool in delivering that file name to somebody else to basically to be able to extract a category and subcategory right out of the file name. Any program and any scripting engine or any tool that wanted to could take that cat ID in the presence of the file name and split it out into the category, subcategory. And that's why we feel it's a use. So thanks for watching. The next video I'm going to add to this playlist, if you skip down a little bit, is going to talk briefly about if you're a vendor and you're interested in using this system, what are the sort of requirements? We use that term very loosely, but I just want to explain that to clear up a couple of misconceptions about that.